to this story about Richard Wolff. Now, this is Economic Update. I used to cover this like weekly, and then other stories came about. There's been so many news stories. But Richard Wolff, he had a discussion on Democracy at Work, Economic Update, and he broke down 4 different issues. The one that we are going to start with is the US dollar and what is happening in the rest of the world. So let's go ahead and jump in there, because hopefully this is everyone's wake-up call. Hopefully.
Called dollar or de-dollarization of the world economy. What do I mean? After World War II, the global economy was so dominated by the United States that the United States currency, the US dollar, became the global currency. So, for example, central banks around the world, seeking to hold reserves that would give confidence to anybody doing business in the currency of that country.
Okay, this takes us back to the conversation that we just had with David Cobb about the public banking. So Richard Wolff is explaining the issue with the central banks. And remember, I've explained on this show before, we eventually have to break away from the central banking system. Look at what has happened, guys. The 2008 housing crisis connected back to the central banks. The regional banks that fell this year, it's still connected right back to the central banking system. And this is why this is not going to withstand for a long time. And that's what David was trying to tell people earlier in the show. This is not long lasting. We cannot continue on this way. And that's why starting these public banks, I think, is going to be crucial as we move forward.
They would hold in reserve gold, the global value behind money at the time, and the dollar, which was deemed literally to be as good as gold, as valuable as gold. So central banks held reserves in gold and held reserves in US dollars. Something like 80-90% of global central banks' reserves were in dollars. Today, that number is less than half. Under 45% of the world's central banks' reserves are in US dollars. Gold, euros, Japanese yen, Chinese yuan, they are replacing, and they're not alone, they are replacing the US dollar.
There you go. You've probably heard this on this show 3 times now, maybe 4. Yeah, this is happening. They're making waves. They're moving forward. You know, there's also a focus where some people are moving more towards like crypto, Bitcoin, etc. I don't necessarily know if that is the answer either. With crypto, it's tricky because if it's not a stable coin, and some of them are. So like, for example, those of us who are on Rockfin, the currency or the crypto that Rockfin uses is a stable coin, right? So they use the Ray. You can convert the Ray to USDC. I don't want to get too in the weeds in this because some of you are like, what are you talking about? But yeah, they use like the Ray, and I convert the Ray to USDC, etc. But those are stable. Not all of them are. So that can be tricky as well. So I don't know. But I do know that globally, when it comes to the US dollar, we need to pay close attention because these things are changing. It could come to a point, maybe in our lifetime, where the US dollar just isn't worth much anymore. Then what? We'll go back to these economic update videos and see what Professor Wolff tried to warn us about.
And the pace of that replacement has accelerated, most of it happening in this century, that is, since the year 2000. But this is not all. The dollar is less and less used These days, compared with 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 60 years ago, the dollar is much less used in international trade. Goods and services and investments moving from one country to another, often in the past, were handled with dollars. The world had to hold on to dollars. Businesses had to hold on to dollars all over the world because their regular business was conducted in dollars. Saudi Arabia took the initiative, with the support of the United States, in creating the so-called petrodollar.
Let's pause there before he gets into petrodollar. Gamer for Life hits the nail on the head here. I was just about to go into this. Yep, cash won't last forever, and the WEF wants all digital and card currency only. There is a Twilight Zone episode, and sorry for the younger peeps in the chat, and some of you may be like, what the hell is the Twilight Zone? But Twilight Zone, one of my favorite shows of all time. I never get tired of watching it. There was a Twilight Zone episode where they fast forward to the future. They got a couple of those, but this one in particular, there were a group of guys and they were trying to basically hibernate themselves with gold into these machines. And in the future, you know, when they wake up, they'll be rich, basically. There's more that goes in the episode. I don't remember everything. But what happens is when you go into the future, there is a couple that finds the one guy, because the other two guys, that one guy killed the other two guys and kept all the gold for himself. Anyway, in the future, there's a couple and they're on this flying car, kind of like the Jetsons. And they see this guy who obviously had been walking through the desert with gold. And they stop and they're like, oh, what happened to this guy? Obviously, he passed out, right? So they're like, what is this? And they pick up the gold and they say, or one of them says, I don't know. It seems like, oh, this at one point in time was actually worth something. Can you believe it? And that's how the episode ends. Now, I don't mean to get all Twilight Zone-y on you. Oh, cool, Sebastian. What's up? I'm Gen Z that love Twilight Zone. I don't mean to get all Twilight Zone-y on you, but that could happen. There may be a time where eventually this doesn't mean anything, where the US dollar isn't worth anything anymore. So when you see that different countries are starting to move to like, or trying to, you know, do different currencies, when you see that crypto has become more and more popular, and then you see where, like they mentioned the WEF, they want to lead to more like a digital currency. Like, we have to wake up, people. There may come a point in time where the US dollar, maybe in our life, where it's not worth anything anymore.
An arrangement in which much of the world's trade of oil, a central source of energy, was conducted in dollars, paid by country A that needed to import oil to country B that needed to export it. And that, of course, meant that you had to keep dollars to buy and handle the energy requirements of your economy. More and more, literally every week now, announcements are made where countries, including Saudi Arabia, are changing over and trading oil for other currencies. China's currency, Europe's currencies, even the currencies of Asia, Africa, and Latin American countries.
And this is basically Saudi Arabia giving a big FU, middle finger, to the US government. Yeah, I know we have like this friendship type thing, but we're going to do our own thing. Like, could you imagine like right now, imagine the Biden administration sitting there thinking like, how dare you trade oil with other countries under different currency? I thought we had an agreement here that we would back each other up. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, is like, yeah, I changed my mind. Just simply like that, like, we decided to do something different. Change mind, change plans, change hands. Just like that. Just like that. Which is also why we should not depend on another country. But don't get me started with that.
And this has enormous consequences. The simplest one to understand is this. The United States has been subsidized by the world's use of its currency. One way to see it is to understand that when foreign countries send goods and services to the United States, wine from France, software programs from Japan, minerals and so forth from Asia and Africa and Latin America, and they pay for them with dollars, they're paying with a very cheap piece of green paper. Costs literally nothing. We get the fruits of labor. We get the creativity of the productive apparatus of the world for Americans to consume, for American businesses to use as inputs to their own production, and all we as a nation have to give in exchange is totally costless pieces of green paper, the dollar.
This also reminds me of resources and the fact that we just don't really produce anything here like we used to, at least not during like my grandparents' generation, where things were actually made in America. So we have gotten to the point where we do depend on other countries to get certain goods. And I said this before, like that was a mistake. It was a mistake for them to allow manufacturing to leave this country. Now, yeah, some of that has come back, but not in the way that it was before. And you never know what's going to happen. People can turn on you. Like I said, with Saudi Arabia, friend today, foe tomorrow. I mean, it can happen anytime. Someone else can come to them. Another country can come to them and offer them a better deal, something that's more in their favor. So we should never depend on that. And this is also why you need to move away from some of these resources that we're dependent on. Oil. We've been talking about this forever. Joe Biden administration, it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican, they're still drilling. You cannot depend on this forever. And what we should have been doing over the past 15, 20 years is talking about a way to transition away from fossil fuels. And so to the point that right now, today, we would already be practicing those other alternative options. You don't just start the conversation now. Like, this makes no sense to me. We have been warned about this in reference to climate change. We've been warned about this for years. Ever since I was a kid, back then it was called global warming. I guess somewhere along the way, they decided that didn't sound too great. Let's make it sound a little bit more friendly. Climate change. But that's what it was called when I was growing up. So 20, 30 years ago, that discussion should have already begun. And right now in 2023, we would already practice that now. But what do I know? What do I know? And everybody else that we put in office, they're backed by these fossil fuel companies, and they just continue to drill. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican.
And then we get a double subsidy. Because, of course, as all the dollars go out to pay for all the goods we import, and those dollars accumulate in the banks, the private banks, the central banks of other countries, they don't want to hold on to a dollar that pays them no interest. They need to hold on to access to dollars. They need to be able to get those dollars because they need them to buy oil and to do the world's business. Yep. But they're not earning anything while they hold the dollars. So know what they do? They turn around and take those dollars and lend them to the United States government. They buy treasury bills. And thereby they fund the budget deficits of the United States. They enable the United States government to tax corporations and the rich much less than they otherwise would have to.
Yep.
It's a subsidy to corporations and the rich, as running the deficits always has been. That is the reality of the double benefit that the dollar as world currency once conveyed on the United States, but the United States is now losing that subsidy.
And the United States is losing other things too. This is very important. When I say that we have to teach people how to grow their own food, we need to do that. We need to do that. I've seen too many doomsdays movies to not be like, you know, there may come a time when you may have to do that. Let's go on.
Losing the ability to borrow the way it once did, discovering that it's going to be harder to finance the deficits of the future U.S. government than it was in the past, because the dollars are not out there waiting anxiously to be lent to the U.S. government as their way of holding the dollar. What will we see in the place of the dollar? Well, basically, there's one of two things. Either the Chinese yuan, because China is the great other of the United States. The U.S. and its allies, that's G7. China and its allies, that's the BRICS.
So someone was asking me this a while back and they thought it was yuan. It is yuan. Yeah, I know. It's spelled yuan, but it's spelled like it would be yuan, but it is actually yuan. But yeah, yuan could replace the dollar. And I saw your comment here. I wanted to get to this as well, Bryce. This is a good point. When the yuan takes over, we will no longer be the world's police. Military spending will plummet. Ding, 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 ding. But one of the reasons why they don't want this to happen, the U.S. government doesn't want this to happen, and Marco Rubio let the cat out the bag, he didn't even try to keep it a secret, was because then the U.S. government wouldn't be able to put sanctions on countries anymore. That's another thing that would happen. That actually would prevent the U.S. government from sanctioning other countries. And then if you want to talk about being the world's police, once that's a wrap, that's it. That is it. And then think about how all those other countries that the U.S. government has sanctioned, if they're the ones that have a little bit more power this time around, think about how they may respond to the U.S.
But we're going to see a new currency replace the dollar, either the Chinese currency or, if they can do it, a composite, a new international currency that will be backed by a bunch of countries, not just by one. You know, we were used to the British pound during the British Empire being the global currency, and the US dollar being the global currency during the heyday of the American Empire. It will be an interesting question whether the emerging China/BRICS global dominance economically will make one or a basket of currencies function as the global exchange medium in the future.
You can make sure it'll be done in a way that works for those countries that are, have that alliance. Like it'll be done in a way so that the countries, maybe more so the countries that are part of BRICS, where it will benefit them in a way. And honestly, can you really be upset with them for that? Can you really be upset with them? I mean, what are they supposed to do? Just sit back and allow the U.S. to police them and continue to let that happen? Karma sucks. I don't know how else to put it, but karma, yikes.
Another dimension of the fast-changing world economy that I want to bring to your attention is the role of China in two basic ways. China is the emerging economic powerhouse. Everyone in the world who pays attention knows that. And one of the interesting ways in which China is playing this emerging powerful role is by becoming a global peacemaker. By far, the most dramatic evidence of that was the role of the Chinese in bringing together the bitter enemies, Iran and Saudi Arabia, who have been bitter enemies for a long time, and efforts to overcome their enmity, insofar as the United States made such efforts, were clearly unsuccessful.
And it also shows, too, that the US government didn't really care about peace because they like the war profit, right? For the military industrial complex. It just goes to show you the United States government, did they really try to create some type of peace in reference to that situation? China was able to walk in just like that and say, all right, let's wrap this shit up. I mean, it's just the way it was done. Just the way it was done. Iran, come here. Saudi Arabia, get over here. Both of you are in timeout until you work this shit out. Just like that. Just like that. So, yeah, it was very telling.
The Chinese did it. They have now exchanged ambassadors, and the secondary and tertiary consequences of peace between those two countries are playing themselves out in the headlines every day. Why is this important? Well, the symbolism could not be stronger. The United States, which liked to position itself as global hegemon, global peacemaker, if possible, has now been challenged by another country playing that role in the same tumultuous Middle East where the United States fancied itself in that role. It now has to share the spotlight if it doesn't lose the spotlight altogether. But beyond the symbolism of peacemaker, there's something else going on here. The fact is that over the last 30 to 40 years, we've had, relatively speaking, peace. Yes, we've had wars. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and so on. But these wars were well localized, mostly in Asia, not only, but mostly, but localized. In the general global perspective, these were decades of peace. And the Chinese are acutely aware that their rise from a poor third world country, with the added burden of being the most populous country in the world, that their incredibly rapid ascendancy to being the great competitive challenger of the United States took place over 40 years of relative, globally speaking, peace.
There you go.
They want the peace because it has worked very well for them.
I hope everybody takes note of that. That may be something to write down. Because it just seems like with the United States, with us, is like, when have we really wanted peace? Not us personally, but our government. You know, every time you turn around, the US government has their hand in another country and they're just escalating things. They're escalating tensions. They're making things worse and more difficult than they were before they showed up on the scene. You know, it's like the United States government, it's like the annoying, uncle. Everybody has that one annoying uncle that just shows up to the cookout. For those of you who don't have cookouts, shows up to dinner, but just shows up to the cookout and everybody knows that they're gonna cause a scene. And it's like everybody kind of tolerates them because they're part of the family, but at the same time, they get on everyone's nerve and everything's going great at the cookout until they show up. And then they show up and they make things worse that shouldn't be worse. They point out obvious tensions that people are trying to hide and, they make it apparent to people. That's like the United States government. United States government is like the drunk, annoying uncle. I don't know how else to put it.
They did not have to disturb their own economy by going on to a wartime footing. They did not have to debit their own economy to move militarily around the world. They don't have foreign bases. They didn't create any. They didn't have foreign adventures. They didn't create any. They could and did devote themselves to economic development with a kind of focus that has something to do with the extraordinary performance they have shown us. They have become, ironically, advocates of an open world economy, of globalizing continuously. Here's the irony some of you should enjoy. On the one hand, the term neoliberalism and the term globalization went hand in hand over the last 30 to 40 years.
Here we go.
They were the ideological way of saying how happy Western capitalists were in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, with the arrival for them of a vast new cheap labor force. It's a capitalist dream. China was bringing its enormous population and presenting them to global mega corporations, capitalists. Here, come to China, and in a lesser extent, come to India, come to Brazil, and you will have very hardworking people who are willing to accept much lower wages, and that will be a profit bonanza for you. And it was. The last 30 to 40 years, our stock market booms in the Western capitalist area. But while that boom for the West was the driving force, China was making its own way forward.
While we were, enjoying the cheap and sometimes free sweatshop labor that was occurring in countries in the global South, during that time, China was creeping its way forward and beginning to offer something else. So this is very true. I'm not going to play the whole video. It's a long video. That's why I'm going to play the whole thing. But let me just let him finish what he's saying here, and then I'll tell you the name of the video.
Using the neoliberal globalist arguments of an open economy, of having capitalists come to China to produce there what they would ship back to their own countries. China became the producer for the world. China's manufacturing exploded.
Yep.
China did better with neoliberalism and globalization than the West, who invented those words and who invented the thrust into that part of the world for reasons of profit maximization.
And what people have to understand and take this with you tonight is that if the US decided back during that time to not be greedy, to continue to produce everything here in America, made in America, to keep the workers that they have, if those CEOs wouldn't have become greedy and decided to, let's try to make these parts in other countries like China, let's send those jobs overseas to China because it'll be cheaper for us, but I'll make more money. If that had never happened, we would be in a different country today. But that did happen. It did happen. And China took advantage of that situation and said, sure, bring your labor over here. Yeah, sure. We'll make these parts and these products for you. And while the US government The United States, the capitalists and the CEOs, all of them here kind of turned their head and went on about their life and counted their stacks of money. Over those 30 to 40 years, China was building an empire. Now here we are in 2023, and they're trying to figure out, how can we get manufacturing back to the level it was in this country after they sent the jobs away? And so the way I see it is, you can't sit here and be angry with China for taking advantage of an opportunity that presented itself to them. And that's exactly what's happening. So you have people who are really angry. They're mad. They say you should fear China. Very, very, very good video. There's other issues he discusses in this video, so I really do think you should watch the whole thing when you get time. It's called Global Capitalism, the Changing World Economy. Definitely check that out. That's Richard Wolff. Let me show you, because they show it here. I thought it said in the description. It's always different when I look at this on the computer versus my phone. Okay. Yeah, the topics he covers: the changing world economy, BRICS outgrow the G7, global de-dollarization speeds up, China's economic strategy, and US people versus leaders on changing world economy. This is a really, really, really good episode. If you have not seen any of them from Democracy Now!, you definitely want to watch that one. Someone reminded me, it was on my to-do list. Someone reminded me of that last night on Call-In. So I definitely wanted to talk about that tonight. But yeah, you've been warned. All three of the things we've talked about in the row: the public banking, we need to move away from the central banks. We talked about what's happening in Brazil with Lula meeting Maduro and all the leaders in South America coming together and trying to see if they have some type of common ground and how they can move forward economically. And then we just listened to Richard Wolff tell you about the US dollar and what's happening in the global market, and if something could replace it within our lifetime. And it looks like it's on that way. So we need to pay attention to what's happening.